Welcome to Smoke and Mirrors, the podcast where we make sense of agricultural policy. I'm Jenny Ift. I teach agricultural policy at Kansas State University. I'm excited to have Jim McDonald with me today. I first knew him when I worked at the USDA Economic Research Service, where he served as an expert on agricultural structure and productivity for decades. I think, Jim, you'll have to clarify that. And he's now at the University of Maryland. So, Jim, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks, Jenny. And I teach ag policy at the University of Maryland.
Okay.
I started at ERS in 1980 and kept an association with them until I retired and moved to Maryland at the end of 2019. So just about 4 decades of working on both competition issues and issues around farm structure and farm productivity. So happy to be here.
And as you know, input prices, agricultural input prices have been in the news for a long time. It was recently announced that the Department of Justice was going to look into this. So I wanted to have a conversation about competition, about market power, about prices in agricultural input markets. But I guess what we should probably start is just what companies are serving the markets for different ag inputs. You can look at pesticides, fertilizer, seeds, major inputs.
Yeah. Well, a reason why competition issues come up frequently in farm input industries is there aren't that many providers. So if we look at seeds, there's basically now big 4 companies: Bayer, BASF, Syngenta / ChemChina, and Corteva. And they're probably 85 to 90% of all seeds sold in the U.S.
Okay.
However, seed competition goes on for particular seed products, corn, soybeans. There, it's usually 2 or 3 big providers. So, in other words, not many firms competing in these businesses. Fertilizers. There's a big 4 that accounts for maybe 80% of sales of nitrogen-based fertilizer products. Mm-hmm. What we call concentration is even higher in phosphorus-based products, by about 85%. There, it's companies that are sort of less well-known, at least to the general public. Companies like Nutrien, Koch Industries, CF, Mosaic for phosphorus-based products. So again, relatively small number of companies, 3 or 4 that really dominate sales. If you get into pesticides, it's similar in the sense that competition occurs in specific types of pesticides aimed at specific types of pests. And in each of those categories, again, you usually look at 2 or 3 or 4 competing rivals. So pretty highly concentrated. And then finally, I can go through many more farm inputs, but let's wrap it up with just tractors and combines.
Absolutely.
There's one big one, right? Deere is usually 55 to 60% of tractor and combine sales in the United States. C&H and AGCO, when you add them in, you get up to 95% of sales in the U.S. Although in equipment, because it lasts a long time, used equipment provides some constraint on the prices. But still, the basic story across input industries is they're pretty highly concentrated. There aren't many sellers in each of these cases.
Right. And I do want to, before we get into some of why we care about competition, I want to get into the what some farmers might see as the retail. So, you have a couple companies that are developing seed varieties, but you might have a local seed company.
That's right.
Yeah.
That gets, you've touched on it getting a little complicated, right?
Yeah.
There are companies that are major seed developers, and those same companies, the major developers, are also developing traits that they might put into their own seeds, or they might sell or license to independent seed producers, and they might also license their own seeds to independent producers. So they'll license their genetics. So as you get into seeds, you might be buying from a local, fairly small seed producer, but they are in turn buying traits and genetics from large seed sellers. That does complicate the market a bit. It's kind of similar in a way in fertilizers and pesticides, where you're going to be buying from a dealer typically. And the dealer may be, in turn, be buying from the manufacturer. And that actually enters into some issues in policy, in competition, and antitrust. We can get to that later.
Right. So sometimes when you're buying the final product, you're going to feel that you're going to see more competition versus, say, implements, where you're almost always going to the dealer. So you can see the two or three companies that control.
Yeah, but we're not talking 10 companies ever, right?
Yeah.
It's usually what you're always talking about is variations on not many.
Yep.
Maybe 1 to 5.
Right. All right. So now let's take a step back and talk about competition. This is something when economists say competition, it's usually something that we think is good. But could you delve into a little bit of what we exactly mean by competition, especially in these input markets?
Well, basically, we're talking about competition often in prices, and competition that will drive prices towards costs. More complicated and a bigger deal in policy lately is competition in rivalry, in innovation, developing new products. And we'll come to that a little bit later. But the first thing we really talk about, having to compete with rivals and how that affects your prices, and in particular drives prices towards costs. You want me to talk about why we care about that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Because we want to talk about market power, so we gotta get there.
Right. So there's two big things that we care about as economists for why we think competition is good. All right. One is what we call allocative efficiency, and I use the example of a famous case from 30 years ago, which was lysine, an ingredient in feed. The case actually showed up in a movie starring Matt Damon. The movie was called The Informant. Lysine is an ingredient in feed, mostly in hog feeds. It allows hogs to absorb feed more efficiently, meaning you use less feed to produce a given market hog, and you produce less poop too if the feed is being converted more effectively. Archer Daniels Midland and several rival producers of lysine fixed prices. That is, they conspire to not compete with each other and drive prices up compared to costs. The way we look at this, the result of driving prices for lysine way above cost is that you're sending a signal to farmers that this stuff's really expensive and you should really economize on it and not use much of it because it's really pricey. And as a result, we wind up buying less of it, farmers. We buy more feed, because lysine economizes on the use of feed. If we use less of it, we're buying more feed and we're generating more poop. And so we're we're moving into a world of feeding hogs that's more expensive and less efficient. We call that, economists call this, allocative efficiency. We're telling you the price signal is prices are way above. The prices for this reflect high costs and lots of use of resources, so we don't use this efficient thing. The second thing we care about is what we call productive efficiency. So the first one was less competition means prices are rising relative to costs and sending poor signals to buyers. The second thing, productive efficiency, is about the effect of rivalry on costs. There's a good example here. The precision planting merger case from about 10 years ago. In that case, two firms at the time, Deere and Monsanto, were producing high-speed planters. Monsanto proposed to sell their business to Deere, and so you're going to get a monopoly in high-speed planters. The Department of Justice successfully opposed the merger and argued that it was the rivalry between the two firms that led to continuous improvements in the equipment and improvements in the production process that brought costs down. So in this case, rivalry, competition, led to better products, more efficient production, lower costs. And so it's those two things, what we call allocative efficiency and what we call productive efficiency, driving costs down and driving prices towards costs, that we think are good about competition, and why economists favor competition, and why in antitrust policy we try to enforce more competition in the U.S. economy.
Yeah, right. So there's benefits for everyone, everyone within an industry or everyone in society, and that's why we have laws about
we think they're very broad benefits.
Right.
Yeah, we think there are very broad benefits from competition.
Right. And so as economists, a lot of times we'll talk about market power and how that can lead to an is it anti-competitive or uncompetitive?
Anti-competitive.
That's right, anti-competitive situation. And so can we dig into what we mean by market power? And my understanding is that there are antitrust laws about it, but it can be very difficult to establish. There's certain conditions for that to be the case, and then to establish that it actually happened. That's really hard to do sometimes.
Yeah. Let me go at first. Yeah. As economists, in economic theory, we have a very precise, clean measure of what we call market power. It's the ability of a firm to set price above cost, and in particular, to set it above what we call marginal cost, the cost of the last unit of production. And we have we can develop very precise equations that both say the degree of market power you have reflects the degree to which you can raise price above costs. Right. And we can also tie it specifically to a few drivers. So we have a very precise definition of what that means. It gets trickier in law. Many of the antitrust laws refer to not market power, but monopoly power.
Right.
As economists, we use those terms interchangeably.
Yep.
In the law, monopoly power means a lot of market power. And it's not very precise about what a lot means.
Yep.
Okay, let me get back. The second part of the question was about difficulty in determining or deciding what it actually is. So let me talk a little bit about that. When I was in grad school, so 50 years ago, there were a lot of questions, but two big questions in I/O at an industrial organization, my field, at that time. One was, is there a tight relationship between market concentration, the things we talked about at the beginning of our conversation, and that measure of market power, the gap between price and cost? Is there a very precise, tight empirical relationship across industries? And secondly, is there a threshold? Is there a level of concentration below which we can say, oh, everything's competitive, and above which we need to be worried? And there was what I would call a very successful research program in the sense we got answers by the mid-'80s. Unfortunately, the answers to each question were no. That is, there is not a tight, precise relationship. There's a very loose relationship between concentration and measures of price gaps. And there's a lot of other stuff going on. And the lot of other stuff going on refers both to things like how easy is entry into, if you're making a lot of money, maybe new firms are going to come in. How easy is that? Yeah. It's a tricky question. And secondly, are there substitutes that might constrain the pricing you can do? And those substitutes can take up a lot of different things. For example, maybe there's another herbicide out there, not quite as good as what you want to buy, right, but it keeps the monopoly seller of the herbicide you want to buy from setting prices too high, right? Or, there are, as I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of used tractors out there. Yep. At a higher price, at a high monopoly price for John Deere tractors, maybe people are going to go to used tractors, or more people are going to sell used tractors. So that constrains what they can do. So in reality, if we're trying to get at the nature of competition markets, particularly for policy and antitrust cases, we got to think about all those other factors, and they matter. Right. So right. That's why a lot of economists get hired in antitrust cases. So there's often a lot of argument. Right.
So the theory is clear, and it's intuitive. It's this difference between your cost of production and the prices you're charging, or the marginal cost. But the reality is actually quite messy.
Yeah. Let me bring one other thing in just to make sure we cover it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mentioned earlier that precision planting case, and that turned on the argument that the rivalry between the two firms pushed them to develop more innovations. Yeah. Now, Nobel Prize in Economics got awarded 2 weeks ago for work on this question. Okay. What's the impact of competition on rivalry and innovation? Yeah. And through innovation to growth. Yeah. And the big question here is, and this goes back to an economist named Joseph Schumpeter back in the 50s who wrote on this topic in a very loose way. Yeah. And what he pointed out was most of the innovations we see in the last century are coming from organized research and development programs. Yeah. In ag, a lot of it might have been funded by public and come through universities, but there's a great deal coming through private firms with large-scale private research programs. those firms aren't usually in competitive industries.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They're all oligopolies, meaning they're in businesses with a few rivals. They're big firms with a few rivals, and they do most R&D.
Yep.
And the reason why they do it, and the reason why, well, to start, the reason why a small firm may not do it is if you come up with a new idea, it's easy to steal it.
Yep. Yep.
And your rivals are going to steal it right away. So why would you put a lot of money in for 10 years and then find out that everybody stole your idea so you can't make any money?
Right, right.
In concentrated businesses, that stealing is a lot slower because there aren't that many rivals. And so we do get more R&D and more of those innovations often in concentrated businesses. The big policy question is how concentrated? Because if I have a monopolist, that is a single firm with no rivals, and I think about spending money on innovating, the problem is if I come up with a new product, all it's going to do is steal business from my existing products. Why do I want to do that?
Yep.
So actual rivalry does matter a lot in that R&D thing, and the question is how much. And these Nobel Prize winners focused a lot on, well, does it matter if I have 5 rivals or 4 or 2? That in turn was the big issue in both the Precision Planting merger and in the big seed merger cases that followed just a little later through 2016 to 2018. So that becomes, if we're thinking about competition in input industries, R&D and innovation matters a lot in those industries.
Absolutely.
And, okay, what's the best way to get R&D and innovation? That is a big, big issue that comes up in policy questions.
Right, right. So if you have hundreds of firms, they're probably not going to be able to invest in R&D. But if you have just one firm, then they might not do it as fast as we would like to see as from a social perspective.
And they might not even do it at all. That's right. And so that is sort of the big question, and a good deal of research and theory work goes on that question. And it is a lot messier than the simple question relating to prices.
Right. So could we dig into sort of when we have these cases, what are the different policy levers that the Department, first of all, it's the Department of Justice that handles antitrust?
Well, actually, the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission handle antitrust. There are some issues that some specific antitrust issues fall specifically to the Department of Justice. So they're the only people that can send you to jail.
Okay. Gotcha.
So we talked earlier about the lysine conspiracy case. Mm-hmm. Collusion, that is agreeing to fix prices, that can be a criminal violation. Okay. But meaning you can go to jail. So that falls to the Department of Justice. They bring those kinds of cases. Merger cases, let me just set back slightly. The statute says merger is illegal, should be opposed, should not be allowed if it's likely to reduce competition. That's all the statute says. The two agencies this is kind of weird, they've sorted responsibility basically on developed expertise. So the FTC always takes like retail food mergers. Mm-hmm. The Justice Department took most of the seed mergers, and they would take equipment mergers. Okay. But anyway, you got two federal agencies that do this stuff and overlap heavily. And
so the primary laws would be you can't, well, I guess, explicitly collude. And maybe we can dig into that more. And mergers can't happen if they reduce competition. Are those the two primary?
They should be disallowed if they are likely to reduce competition. That's the basic language.
That's the basic language. Does collusion have to be explicit? Does it have to require the kind of communication that you see in the informant or other cases?
That is how the laws have been applied.
Okay.
The evidence in it and the cases are, heavily detective oriented. Do we have evidence that you met and that you actually agreed?
Yeah.
As in the informant.
Yeah.
If you independently that monopoly prices are best for each of the rivals, but you don't explicitly agree, that's legal.
Yeah.
So what we call implicit collusion is legal.
So you could have 2 or 3 firms that they know that if they drop their prices, it's going to ultimately lead the game theory, right?
Right.
Then they could just keep things where they're at, and if they're all acting together, they never have to talk to each other, and it's completely legal.
Yes. So there was a famous antitrust case involving private colleges in the Northeast, maybe 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And the Ivy League schools, they all insisted on actually meeting in a hotel room, as it turned out, in Hartford, Connecticut. And that was plainly illegal. The engineering, I was teaching at RPI, a well-known engineering school at the time. RPI, MIT, Clarkson, Cornell Engineering. We're engineers. We can figure math out, right? We don't have to meet. And in fact, we're very uncomfortable meeting because we're not very personable people. So the engineering schools, what they did was legal, right? They would just look at financial aid offers and figure it out, the game theory, and not meet. Meeting and explicitly agreeing is what's illegal.
Right.
Now, one other thing, though. We've covered 2 antitrust cases, types of antitrust issues. A third is actually more and more relevant now in ag. If you have monopoly power, it is illegal to try to take actions aimed at maintaining or extending that power. So again, it's legal to be a monopolist. It's legal to price like a monopolist. It's not legal to maintain it or extend it. And that works like if you take steps to try to make it harder for entrants to come in and use your market power that way, or to create a monopoly in a related business. So that does come up in 2 actually current antitrust cases involving food inputs. One of them concerns John Deere practices and well known in the news all the time. John Deere practice concerns what in the news is called right to repair.
Yep.
Farmers historically have done a lot of their own tractor repairs or hired independent service providers to do the repairs. And in those cases, they're frequently buying replacement parts from someone who's not the original equipment maker, which in this case would have been John Deere. The big controversy these days is John Deere's got a lot of software in the tractors that identifies what's wrong with it, and they only release the package that allows you to read that software to their own dealer, forcing farmers to rely on John Deere dealers to do their repairs rather than do it themselves. That's been a big controversial issue in farm country now for at least a decade.
Yep.
A couple of years ago, the Federal Trade Commission brought an antitrust case on this issue, and they looked at it, that is, in the frame of antitrust. And the argument is John Deere has monopoly power. We said earlier, like a 60% market share for tractors and combines, in tractors and combines. The argument is that they are trying to extend that monopoly power into the separate market for services and for replacement parts. That is, by forcing farmers to go to the dealer, for the John Deere dealer, for software to figure out what's wrong when the tractor breaks down. The dealer is then going to, if it needs replacement parts, it's going to take them from John Deere. And so the argument is that John Deere is trying to drive out independent service providers and independent replacement parts providers and use their market power in the original equipment market, tractors and combines, to try to extend or create monopoly power in the replacement parts market by driving those firms out. And that's in court. We'll see where the judges believe them. But that is the argument of the antitrust practice of it's called an exclusionary practice. Okay. You're trying to exclude entrants. There's a second case, also brought by the Federal Trade Commission. In this case against Corteva and Syngenta, 2 major providers not only of seeds. This is about pesticides. Many pesticides are patented, so you have a legal monopoly. The way patent policy works is the patent expires after a while, and the idea is the patent's expired, now we're going to get generic entrants coming in, and we're going to get a lot of competition. Right. So we're going to get a lot more rivals after the patent expires. The argument here is that Syngenta and Corteva have payment programs with dealers, actually slightly more complicated.
Yeah.
There's a few distributors who then sell to dealers, who sell to a lot of dealers. So this is about the relationship with the distributors. Corteva and Syngenta's programs pay bonuses to distributors if they carry a small share only of generic products. In some cases, that share is zero. We're going to pay you more as long as you don't sell any generics. We'll pay you another amount if only 10% of your sales of these products are generics. The argument there is, again, that exclusion case. The argument is that Syngenta and Corteva are taking steps to exclude rivals or make it harder for rivals to get into the business, and therefore extending their monopoly power in those particular types of pesticides at issue. So, in my view, these types of cases may become more important in the future in ag input industries because almost all of them rely on dealers.
Okay.
And the concentration, as we said earlier, is up at the manufacturer stage. There is a growing amount of innovation, particularly, actually in all categories, and all of it, much of it coming from small and new entrants. And I suspect that a lot of these issues are going to become more important in the future as we see incumbent producers taking steps to try to keep out potential new rivals in their businesses.
Right. So is it always the government that brings these cases? I think in a merger, It's just you have to apply for a merger. But if there's these cases of collusion or sort of this sort of illegal use of monopoly power, does the government bring that? Could you sue another company? How does the process work?
There is a large private antitrust series of cases, many of them in recent years. In the last 15 years, there's a huge wave of them in meat, in poultry, beef processing. The arguments in those cases are typically collusion case arguments that arguing that firms are exercising monopoly power through various types of collusion and damaging buyers in some cases. Usually it's meat buyers bringing the cases. In some cases is collusion against farmers driving their prices down. So that's a very active area. In fact, I got subpoenaed and interviewed a few weeks ago on a case involving chickens and sales of chicken. It was retail chains and some wholesale chains suing in a class action against them. So yes, that's a large case. The government has a lot more subpoena power.
Okay.
And so there are cases in which the government can do a lot more. In addition, if the government wins a case, it becomes entered easily into a private case, and so you can kind of build on litigation. But there's a lot of that going on.
Okay.
And in the examples I gave earlier, you could have had private of the John Deere case and the herbicide case. You could have had private litigation going on.
Okay. All right. The next topic is what could the DOJ do now? Like what policy levers do you think the DOJ could use now to look into agricultural input prices? Is that something you're comfortable discussing?
I'm happy to discuss it.
Okay.
I don't think anything's going to come of it at all.
Okay.
Because I don't think there's anything there. This goes on all the time, right?
Yep.
If we see an increase in input prices, you'll get Congress asking the DOJ to look at it.
Okay.
Or if you see an increase in beef prices, Congress asks USDA to look at it.
Right.
We carry out an investigation and prices go down. So see, it worked. No, I mean, typically, if we're seeing big price movements, it's rare that it would be because of collusion or because of an antitrust case. It's because of big things going on in those markets.
Right.
If in inputs for fuels and chemicals, we rely heavily on fossil fuels. If oil prices are going up, input prices are going to go up, and they go up a lot.
Absolutely.
And oil prices crash, our input prices then crash following it, right? That doesn't have a lot to do with market power per se.
Right.
As I've tried to suggest, I think there are persistent, long-term, real issues about market power. It doesn't have a lot to do with, big fluctuations, which is where Congress gets involved asking you to do things.
Okay. Okay, so what you're saying is historically we've seen Congress and the president ask for investigations into industry when consumer or producer, I guess, consumer prices, or in the case of ag input prices go up. This is pretty common.
Yeah, and it's kind of a political issue, but it rarely is really about antitrust or competition. I won't say never, and I want to emphasize that there are real competition and antitrust issues. It's just they don't fluctuate the way commodity prices do.
Right. So what people feel the most of the time is sort of market forces, supply issues, say with oil or other things.
Yeah, I think it's rarely a pure competition.
So what are the tools that government have other than antitrust laws to look into competition?
Well, there's a number of tools that you can use. One is, as we've touched on in a way, is patent policy. We give firms a patent that is the exclusive right to sell a new product that they've developed, and we have a long system to decide what's new and what's innovative. And if that's also valuable, well, you've got a monopoly in it for the length of the patent. We do that to give you an incentive to invest in R&D. We can tailor that. We can tailor the length of the patent. We can play around with what's patentable, what's really new and what's not new. And that does get you to a trade-off between competition and giving monopoly power as a reward for developing something new. So that's always kind of a trade-off, and there are sometimes real conflicts.
Yeah. Okay.
In addition, trade policy matters. For businesses in the United States in which we've got just a few sellers, competition often comes from imports from international competitors. To the extent that we put tariffs on, for example, to use a current example, on imports that compete with concentrated industries in the United States, well, we fully expect, and evidence is, that those U.S. firms facing less competition are going to raise their prices and exercise more market power. So trade plays an issue in competition as well. We regulate natural monopolies. Natural monopoly is something where we think the most efficient way to produce, the low-cost way to produce, is one firm, maybe because scale economies are so large.
Right.
So we sometimes, typically for electric utilities or communications, we regulate those firms and their prices directly. That's tricky and not something we really want to jump into willy-nilly.
Right.
But regulation is an alternative. Then finally, sometimes you can use procurement policy. For example, in USDA, we finance the purchase of nearly half the infant formula in the United States.
Right.
Through the WIC program. Infant formula is a tight oligopoly. 3 firms produce all the infant formula in the country.
Yep.
They have a lot of market power. Their prices are way above marginal cost. USDA is able to buy formula at dramatic reductions in wholesale prices. So they're able to use their buying power and some sophistication in doing so and designing auctions to greatly reduce the market power held by those formula makers. So there's a lot of other alternatives, although antitrust is the big one.
Right. So that would be through the WIC, Women's Infants and Children Program, that the USDA uses as an auction to procure baby. That sounds like a very interesting policy innovation. Could you talk about it more?
I thought it was fascinating. USDA holds annual state-by-state auctions for the right to be the WIC provider for infant formula. So the winner of the auction is whoever offers the lowest wholesale price for specified types of infant formula, and it's winner take all.
Okay.
All the WIC business in that state for the period of that auction, typically it's annually, and we track a lot, and it's designed in such a way that the consumer is still just going to the local supermarket and getting the formula. If they want to use the WIC voucher for that formula, they have to get the WIC formula.
Okay.
And then we set up a system in which the companies, the manufacturers, are rebating USDA for it. So the competition's on the wholesale price. Okay. We track all this evidence, and there are these dramatic price reductions. Typically, USDA pays 10 to 20% of the wholesale price. So the rebate is 80 to 90% of the wholesale price, which, let me go 2 directions from there. That indicates, boy, the non-WIC price. That's a lot of market because we don't expect them to be selling to us at a loss.
Right.
They're probably selling at close to marginal cost. The second thing is WIC is not an entitlement program. You don't just get WIC benefits because you qualify. The budget's set for a given year. So if we get lower prices for formula, we can serve more people.
Right.
So the competition allows the program to provide more WIC benefits to more people. It's a very clever way, to me, of inducing competition in a really quite concentrated industry.
Yeah, that's an interesting.
Yeah. It showed up in a few micro textbooks as ways of inducing competition through.
Right. And you rarely get that level of information. You talked about a firm's marginal cost. Like you can kind of get that with these. In most industries, it's a lot more work to get there, I'd imagine.
We can kind of infer it in this case. We don't actually get it from them. What we have is all these bids and prices.
Right.
But
yeah,
it's probably pretty close to marginal cost.
Right. Absolutely. All right. So I don't know if there's any other questions related to patents.
I think I
trade.
spoke fast.
Okay.
We kind of covered.
Yeah. No, we've covered an awful lot. So I might have forgot to tell you this. I remember about half the time. I always ask people two things at the end.
Okay.
And you can pass, or you can do both, or you can do one, whatever. Right. But the first question is, in terms of the work you do, is there something that you would like people to know about that maybe they don't know about? And the second one is, you get to make one policy change. What is it?
Oh, okay. Let me start with the second one first.
Yeah.
Among those economists who think we should be more aggressive in merger policy. Mm-hmm. So, in the big seed company mergers that occurred, is ChemChina buying Syngenta, Bayer buying Monsanto, DuPont and Dow merging. In those cases, the focus for the Justice Department, so there's a lot of markets, right? All kinds of markets for seeds, traits, chemicals. Focus of the Justice Department was in those cases where the merger would move us from having 2 rivals to 1 or 3 rivals to 2. All right, so highly concentrated markets.
Yeah.
Me, I'd like us to see more concern about markets where it's maybe 4 to 3, even 5 to 4. So in that sense, if I had to pick one, I would, and I think there are other economists who agree with me, I would like to see a more aggressive policy on mergers. Now, that means you got to convince judges of that, which is not that easy. So that's a long-term, constant work kind of change, right? Secondly, so here's one. I'm doing another conversation next week. One of the things I've done a lot at ERS was consolidation in agriculture, or the transformation of farms. Big shifts towards much bigger farms. Right. And the one that's the most striking is dairy, where you get just dramatic shifts over time towards much larger dairy farms. And I think there's a lot of fundamental economics driving that.
Right.
And it's not only much larger, but it also means much fewer. So really, in the last 20 years, a 70 to 80% decline in a number of what I would call small commercial dairy farms, people milking the 200 cows. Yeah. And the conversation wasn't aware of this. A group from an occupational health center. There are 10 of these in the United States. Yeah. Centers for occupational health in agriculture, fisheries, and forests. They contacted me, and we're going to have a conversation about health impacts of this change, and particularly mental health, which I thought, that's really interesting, because this is hugely, obviously, for the people going out, this is often a hugely stressful
Absolutely.
thing. And not something that we think about as economists, because we don't really have any data. It's an interesting issue, and the people involved are mostly sociologists, so I get to we'll talk to them a little bit about bigger, broader impacts of this transformation. And I think that's not something we know anything about. But I think it is an interesting side issue of this transformation that's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a human cost to that. So when I worked at in upstate New York, you had
you were Cornell, right? Yeah,
New York FarmNet, and they were back I don't know, it was 20 or 30 years ago when there were a lot of farmer suicides. They were founded
Yeah.
out of that, and they respond to farmer calls about financial stress, and there's a lot of stress. Here we have the Kansas Ag Mediation Services, and I believe that's funded out of Farm Bill funding.
Yeah.
I forget the title, but I talk to them frequently. What are you hearing? Because they are on the front line of what's happening financially, and they know the human side too.
The people I'm talking to are actually up in New York. They're located actually in Cooperstown at working at the hospital there.
Yeah.
And so, I'm looking forward to this conversation. And I have a long personal history. I lived in upstate New York for 20 years.
Yeah.
And so, I know the visuals of driving down a dairy valley, and there's one of the 10 farms that were there is still there, and it may be as much milk as the valley was back then. But these are sort of big visual changes. I can see the visual changes.
Absolutely.
Thinking about the human changes behind it is something that I'm going to find out more about next week.
Yeah, no, I'm really glad to hear that you're doing that. And I think there's a lot of scope for economists and people that work on that side of things to work together in the future.
Yeah, and kind of go back and forth to each other on a number of these things.
Yep, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yep, good talking to you, Jenny.